This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. This week we are going to talk about the Valkyries. Now, Valkyries, Valkyrie is obviously we are talking about female figures from Norse mythology. The name Valkyrie actually means chooser of the slain, which we're going to talk about what that refers to specifically. Valkyries seem to be, there's a sort of a popular, fanfic or, fantasy fic kind of character. And I find that they seem to be very popular today in terms, at least the term Valkyrie is very, very popular in terms of describing a certain type of, empowered female or, I hear different things about, like I know somebody said she's going to undergo Valkyrie training and things like that. There seems to be this association with the Valkyrie among, people who have a modern interest, perhaps in Norse folklore and myth, to look at a Valkyrie as a kind of, in a way that some of these other dark goddesses are, almost as a figure of empowerment of some kind. But the Valkyries they're quite complicated, actually, in terms of their background. Certainly we have the Scandinavian and the Norse versions. There's also the Germanic Valkyries as well. And we see this particular figure, appearing, certainly with the Valkyries are talked about in Wagner's Ring Cycle, for example, and in his opera. They're and there's also an Anglo-Saxon term for a very similar kind of figure. And they do actually bear a resemblance to certain other warlike female figures that you see throughout both Celtic, Germanic, Saxon kinds of mythologies, and I would say potentially elsewhere as well. Now, this does not imply that the mythology of the Valkyrie is the same, that they're quote unquote the same as some of these other figures, but the similarities are interesting, and I think what I want to explore are what some of these characteristics are, and what the what the similarities are, and what the differences are, and how we can view these figures as a force, or about what they tell us about the way that this aspect of the feminine, this fiercer aspect of the feminine, operates in our sort of cultural narrative. Okay, so now as far as the actual stories about Valkyries, there's so many of them. We have first of all we have the Eddas, these from the 13th century. As is mentioned here, it says Valkyries are attested in the Poetic Edda, and as well as the Prose Edda, and and several other sagas. We're looking at roughly around 13th to 14th century is where we see a lot of these stories. There are runic inscriptions that mention the Valkyries, and they are, and there's this other term, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be saying this correctly. I did actually learn Old English many, many years ago, but, I'm not going to swear that I'm saying this correctly. I think it's Whalekirk, I think is how you say this word. That is a term that means almost the exact same thing as Valkyrie, and that the stories of them seem to be quite similar. Now, okay, so when we talk about a Valkyrie, like what are they? Who are they? Okay. Well, now in the Eddas and the sagas mentioned, first of all, there's many of them. I think Wagner mentions in his opera, he talks about 9 of them, and he has a different interpretation of them. His interpretation is not the original interpretation of what a Valkyrie is. But it said that these are mortal women born of mortal parents, and there are many, many of them. Okay. It's not really a matter of where they come from, but rather that they serve Odin, and that in their being in service to Odin, that they end up, they have certain supernatural powers. One of these powers is definitely flight. They're able to fly and are often portrayed as having swan wings or being in the shape of swans. Having these, as it said, feather cloaks. And as it's mentioned in this one site here, one like Freya owns that Loki often borrows to fly. Okay, and Freya, she is also connected with the Valkyries again. Whether or not Freya has a certain interpretation as a Valkyrie, or at least as having characteristics of a Valkyrie, is another whole question and another subset. Freya being the love goddess, okay, that we see in Nordic mythology. I mean, she's a love goddess among other things, and like many of these goddess figures, especially love goddesses, they are not one-dimensional in their in their characteristics. You can't just say, oh, she's a love goddess, so she's all just sweetness and light and abundance. She has other characteristics. She has some tricky characteristics as well, but there is an association with her in certain texts as being connected to the Valkyries. Okay. Now, what their job is. Now, I said their name means choosers of the slain. And this specifically relates to the idea of the battlefield. Okay, there are several different depictions or understandings of what the underworld is, or at least the afterlife, in Norse mythology. And the Valkyries are there. When a battle is taking place and the soldiers fall, they pick the best. They are picking certain warriors to be taken to Valhalla, to Odin's hall. Because the warriors that go to Valhalla, which we tend to think of as being a heavenly type place. I don't think that's I don't think you can make a one-to-one comparison there. But really what it is they are being brought. They are warriors chosen by Odin to abide with him in preparation for Ragnarok, assuming I'm saying that correctly too. But this is kind of a apocalyptic end time event, like end time battle, that Odin is, where Odin is choosing his army for this sort of, end of the world kind of scenario. And so what the Valkyries do is they are the ones who choose the slain warriors, and they are brought back to, Valhalla. It says here, they have the ability to travel between realms of living mortals on Midgard and Odin's Hall in Valhalla, carrying dead warriors from Midgard's battlefields to Valhalla. And the Valkyries serve these dead heroes their drinks in the evening at Valhalla as well. So they are there to choose them and also to be of service to them. So as this one site mentions, Valkyrie is a job rather than a species, but it's a job with special perks. Now, so there's certainly, so we have this idea that they do have special powers. They usually are presented in kind of battle gear. Sometimes they are either associated with ravens. I don't know that I've seen that they take the form of ravens, but more that they are in alliance with ravens as the carrion birds, and they seem to have a connection to them. Because they choose warriors from the battlefield, we have also seen at times that people have tried to connect them to the Norns, which are the fates within Scandinavian mythology. Now they're not the Norns, and they're not fates, and they're not they're not technically, really, they said they don't really seem to have much of a prophetic role either. But in the fact that they may choose the fate of the warrior after death, I think this is why frequently they're confused with the Norns, or they're conflated with the Norns in some fashion. Now, some of the other complications in knowing about the Valkyries, as mentioned here, as Wagner's ring cycle, he's taken some license with the Eddas, and he combines, for example, they say he combines the goddess Freya with the goddess, I want to say this is pronounced, I don't know if it's Eitun or Itun. It's one or the other. I'm not sure if the I is long or short. Whose apples keep the gods young. They become a new composite figure called Freya, Freia. Okay, and they're within the ring cycle. And it's also suggested that Wagner has taken speculations from Grimm's tales, and given the gods other roles and functions, or given them other they get their species or their role changed within the context of the work. And says in Wagner's plays, the Valkyries are 9 demigoddesses fathered by Odin and blessed with immortality. So the fact that they're demigoddesses means Odin is their father, and they have some kind of human mother. And and again, in this depiction, they're immortal. Okay. Now the origins, though, of the Valkyries, like we saw in many examples within Slavic mythology, which of course is, again, they're not the same, but when you're often talking about earlier traditions that transform over time and end up taking on different meanings, the Valkyries seem to originally have been figures of terror. They were described as being demonic in nature. This is a theory from Rudolf Simek, who says they were probably viewed as demons of the dead, to whom warriors slain on the battlefield belonged. Okay. Now, again, there's that word demon, that very loaded word that invokes different responses in different people depending on where you're coming from. Again, the term demon we often associate with something that's evil. And probably we're talking more about a daemonic type of a figure. More of a kind of a, some kind of a spirit of the otherworld that is connected to, to the events of this world in some fashion. And he suggests that there's a shift in interpretation of what a Valkyrie is when the concept of Valhalla changes from being a battlefield to a warrior's paradise. Okay. And, again, looking at the era in which we're writing, there could be a Christianization factor that goes on there. Or if not even a direct Christianization at that point, certainly there's a more dual view of things. Because, at least one thing that's been suggested, at least I've seen one academic article that had suggested the idea of Valkyries as being kind of a third gender. Although I don't want to say that I'm entirely convinced by that argument, and I'll explain why. But nonetheless, you started to see these more complex female characteristics being separated out in some fashion, in terms of what the later conception of the feminine, or what the feminine ought to be, becomes, again, in that Christian model, there becomes this idea of the feminine who submits, the one who submits to having a husband, the one who deals more in love and not so much in war. Like there's like a separating out. There's a certain dualism that starts to come in there that does not exist in these older female figures, whether they be goddesses, whether they be demigoddesses, or whether they be daemonic spirits, or, mortals given some kind of superpower. Okay. They're not, there's a tendency here to take something that is a very powerful or potent feminine force that can be intimidating or terrifying or horrifying or harmful, and to try to mutate it or neutralize it in some fashion. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I do want to say a little bit more about the stories here. Okay, now one of the things we want to look at here are the these ideas of the underworld that we see in Norse myth, because they're not the they're not the typical. It's not the underworld. It's not a unilaterally. We're not talking about a heaven and hell thing, and of course, as we know, hell in Norse mythology, that's a whole separate podcast that I did a year or two ago. Can't remember that, but hell, Hel, is actually among them. We know that there are different places that the dead go depending on their role. The otherworld is not a unilateral place, nor is it about divine judgment or punishment. Now, the World History Encyclopedia talks about this, and this is what they say about the Otherworld. Say Valhalla is Odin's Hall of Heroes, where spirits of fallen warriors battle each other all day, return to life and health in the evening, and spend the night drinking. It says it was one of 5 possible afterlife destinations in Norse belief, the others being, I'm not sure if I'm going to say this right, Folkvanger, there's Hell, there's the realm of Ran, and then there's the burial mound. Okay, and says the goddess Freya presided over Folkvanger and chose half the dead on the battlefield for her realm. The Valkyries chose the other half for Odin. The realm of Hell, presided over by the Jotun Hel, was primarily for those who died of old age or sickness, though there are notable exceptions, while the realm of Ran was for those who drowned, especially at sea. The burial mound was one's grave or tomb, which was considered the final home of the dead, no matter how they died, at different times in Scandinavian history. So yeah, there's almost a this gets back to the flavor of death as, first of all, being intimately connected to the earth, and there's this kind of these mounds, or these ancestral mounds that are, I mean, they're a place where the dead reside, but the dead may also reside elsewhere as well. So we're talking about, while it's not explicitly stated here, there's almost this idea that there are different, as the soul leaves the body, the soul also may, there may be aspects of the soul that part and go in different ways. There's this idea of almost an of Adela that, or shadowy, figures that are more ancestral, that might be more connected to the body or more connected to the burial site, whereas there are others that, there's another aspect that like the Greek would have thought of as the psyche or the psyche, that might fly away and, either go to some other afterlife destination, possibly be reincarnated in some traditions, depending, but there seems to be different aspects of the soul. Something I've talked about in the past, the Egyptians probably had, the most complex idea about the soul. I mean, I think there's at least, I think in my book, I cite at least 5 different, parts to the soul that seem to, some stay with the body, some fly away, some go to the afterlife, some, there's kind of this breaking apart. And, but generally, but a lot of cases we'll see 2, the most dramatic case, I don't know if the dramatic is the right word, but probably one of the clearest illustration of what I'm talking about, Heracles is probably the clearest indication. Because we know Heracles was a demigod. Okay, Zeus is his father. He does die at some point, but because of his completing of his labors, he's granted immortality. So he is taken up to Mount Olympus, and he's the only human, except maybe Semele, the mother of Dionysus. She's the only one who was brought up to live with the gods on Mount Olympus. That's not something that happens after death. You don't get to be with the gods. That idea of quote unquote being with God after death is very much a much later monotheistic concept, really more of a Christian concept, to be honest, because it's really in that, 2nd century CE, 2nd to 3rd century CE, that we start seeing writings about, the martyrs who are in the arms of Jesus in heaven kind of thing. That's not usually a thing. Heracles, though, you find that he's married to Hebe, the cupbearer of the gods. But Odysseus also encounters Heracles in the underworld. He encounters his Eidolon, his shade. And he says, but it actually is, says in the Odyssey, Heracles, the man, of course, now resides, with, I forget, golden-footed Hebe. I forget what her epithet is right now off the top of my head. But that, he basically says, oh no, well, Heracles, the man, is actually on Mount Olympus. But, this aspect of him, this shade of his human life remains here. So that's one very clear example. That said, Heracles is an exception. You don't normally see this, this other aspect of the soul going to live with the gods. But it does demonstrate the idea that there are 2 different components to him, and that there is still a part of him that is attached to the earth and to the underworld. And we seem to see a very similar idea here. Okay, so Just to read on in this entry, it says Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, may have originally simply been another name for the land of the dead, and was envisioned as a vast battlefield, but evolved into a hall of heroes who are not only led there after death by the Valkyries, but are then served by them once they have become, I think it's pronounced Einherjar, an army of one, a hero who can handle any situation. So in other words, this is when they've, almost become perfected in their role as a hero, that they're a one-man army. The Valkyries then not only play the role of the Norns or the Fates, okay, so there's that, seeing that type of connection or type of role in deciding who lives and who dies in battle, but also of the psychopomp. Yeah, that's a favorite word. The guide in the afterlife. So yeah, in ancient Greek religion, you see Hermes, or or Hermes, as some people like to say, guiding the souls down to the underworld. And the psychopomp here, in this case, provides and cares for the souls once they've arrived in Odin's hall, even engaging in love affairs with some of them as well as with living mortals. The Valkyries are Odin's loyal subjects, who most likely die in battle with him. Thor, the heroes of Valhalla, and many others at Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Okay. So, yeah, they're basically being, existing. They're warriors that are perfected in their art of war, and their afterlife consists of continually making war and then celebrating, like this cycle of enjoyment, celebration, and battle, like constantly, until they reach this final battle, this twilight of the gods. Okay. So this goes on to say, the Valkyries feature in stories from the 13th century, the prose and poetic Eddas, as well as in Germanic works. Now, it says Norse mythology was passed down orally for generations until about 1000 to 1100, when the region was converted to Christianity, which introduced literacy. Okay. So all the extant Norse myths were written by Christians or by those living in the Christian era who were at least influenced by that religion. Yeah, and so this is very similar to what we see in Ireland and other places where Christianity comes in and infiltrates. They bring things that were originally part of an oral tradition, then become written tradition. I've talked extensively about the connection between Christianity and Logos, or even between monotheistic traditions and Logos, having to do with these books, these hierogamos, these sacred scriptures that people have. And so as soon as you start codifying things in this kind of Logos form, in this written word, then it transforms with that, along with those who are doing the transmitting, according to whatever their biases are. And of course, the Christian bias is quite dualistic, whether it's intended to be or not. Okay, it says, when the concept of the Valkyrie was first conceived of is unknown, but they may originally have been death demons along the lines of the Greek Charis, who feasted on the bodies of the slain across battlefields and brought their souls to an underworld afterlife, which of course would explain their connection to carrion birds like ravens or crows as well, because they feast on the flesh. The concept of Valhalla is thought to have developed relatively late, and previously to have referred simply to an afterlife realm, possibly in the mountains, or in one's burial mound, but not the ornate hall of heroes as described in the Prose Edda, which is possibly suggested by the Christian heaven. The English Valhalla comes from the Norse Valhall, where hall may have originally meant rock, not hall, so referred to a rock of the slain, meaning either a mountain or a rock-strewn battleground. Okay, so this is what they're saying. It says, similarly, the Valkyries are thought to have once been more menacing figures who carried souls away to a generic afterlife where anyone, warrior or not, ate and drank as they had in life. Again, very much like the concept of Hades that we're familiar with. With the development of Valhalla as a hall of heroes, it is thought that the Valkyries were equally transformed from dark death demons to gleaming figures, epitomizing both feminine beauty and masculine strength and martial skill. Okay, now that's a concept I want to come back to. It says, it also has been suggested that the Valkyrie's image changed during the Viking Age, which is around 790 to 1100, under influence from the shieldmaiden, a woman who took up arms and fought alongside men. The grave of one such woman has been claimed to have been discovered in 2017 near the town of Birka in Sweden, though the interpretation of the remains as those of a warrior woman has been challenged. Scholars continue to debate whether these women existed historically, but there is no doubt they were featured in legend and myth. Among the best known from Norse tales are the goddess Freya, the shield maiden Lagertha, and the heroine Hervor, I think, along with the great Valkyrie Brunhild, who challenged Odin's will. Now, again, that's you see that in Wagner. The Valkyrie image may also have been suggested by Celtic heroines such as the Morrigan or Queen Maeve, or Celtic women who dressed and fought like men. Now, there are similarities there. Again, one needs to be really careful about suggesting that, one came from the other, or one was influenced by the other. I would be really careful about doing that. And I'm going to talk a little more about that too. It says trade relations between Celts and Scandinavians are established, so this is a possibility. As is the suggestion that Norse women in the Viking Age could also be warriors. I mean, you definitely see female warriors in both Britain and in Ireland from ancient times. It isn't necessarily out of the question that would be, we do see these mythological female characters who definitely have warlike characteristics, in addition to anything else that they have. Now, he mentions that this entry mentions that women in Scandinavia had nearly the same rights as men, and the histories of Saxo Grammaticus from around 1160 to 1220 report shield maidens fighting for the Danes, though this story has been challenged. Wives and daughters of Vikings would have had to know how to defend themselves in the lands when the men were off on their journeys. The Swedish tale of Blenda of Smallen, 500 or 750, who leads the women of her village in killing an invading army of Danes after getting them all drunk, was popular enough to be repeated up to the 17th century, illustrating the respect accorded to women as warriors, in this case in the absence of men, but in other stories as shield maidens fighting alongside males. Okay. Now there's more of a discussion here of the this vision of the afterlife. Which I'm going to just skip over for now. It says, Freya is another candidate as the model for the Valkyrie, as she is depicted as arriving on the scene in battle and choosing heroes for her own hall. This Volkvanger is the realm of the people, depicted as a lovely world of flowers, fields, and streams. Freya is said to take half the dead for herself, and the Valkyrie the other half for Odin. Those who do not die in battle have different destinations awaiting them. Okay. So we're not going to get into... I've discussed the realm of hell and so forth in other podcasts, so I'm not going to talk about that here. Now, just to sort of finish up this World History Encyclopedia entry, it says Valkyries are consistently associated with transformation apart from their role as guide and comforter of the fallen. As they faithfully obey Odin's wishes, they are sometimes referred to as the Wish Girls, but this also applies to their role in granting the wishes of mortal men they favored or who were caught by them. This catching took the form of a man stealing a Valkyrie's clothes while she bathed in a brook or stream. The man would hide the clothing, and the Valkyrie would fall under a kind of spell in which she became the wife and mother of his children. If she found her clothes, she would vanish, and the man would have to undertake a quest to find her, perform one or more arduous tasks to prove himself worthy and win her back, all of which would change him from a mere man to a hero. Valkyries are also associated with birds, especially ravens, which links them with the power of second sight, divination, and flight. Although, as I said, there's not a whole lot about Valkyries and second sight. But they are associated with transformation. Another version of the tale features a swan maiden, the Valkyrie in swan form, whose magical feathered covering is taken by the man, who then becomes her husband until the feathers are discovered by her. And then, so there's, okay. So we can see there's a lot of parallels here between this kind of folklore and the folklore of Scotland, of Ireland, other places in Northern Europe, shall we say. And when I think of the Valkyrie as having her clothes stolen, this is a bit like the mythology of the Selkie, the seal woman, who when she bathes and leaves her seal skin, if her seal skin is stolen, then the man who steals it, she can be made into his wife, made to serve him and to bear his children and so forth. So we have this figure, and as I said, there's many stories, and I don't know that I want to get into the details of all the stories. What's just very clear here is that these are women who are choosers of the slain. Okay, they have an association with certainly with Odin. with this afterlife, they can take on swan forms. They are also associated with ravens and carrion birds. And they're always associated with war in some fashion. Now, this idea of them as serving heroes in Valhalla, again, since we're looking at a context here that's Christian, again, there's this idea of the woman as being in this kind of serving role. And one of the things, at least I've read, is that they are, we see them starting out as these kind of terrifying female figures that may have feasted on the dead in the battlefield, which does make them gives them an aspect a bit like the Morrigan's Bove or Bave aspect, which is the one where we see it as a crow, and the one that is really associated with the bloodshed on the battlefield, or the fury of the battlefield. And so okay, what the one characteristic that I find really interesting about this is the way in which we've talked about the way in which the dark feminine is dealt with as a theme in cultural narratives, and particularly in later, the more hierarchical a society gets, and perhaps the more patriarchal a society gets, the way that these narratives are rechanneled or reused, or whether they're treated as didactic, moralistic, or cautionary tales, or whether the powers of the woman end up being sort of domesticated. And I think this is what we're looking at here. You have this idea of, first of all, you have this idea of this woman. All the stories of the Valkyries that I've looked at, you're typically looking at very, very beautiful women. You're not looking at, trolls and, these kinds of figures that are associated with, that are very wild and feral, these Dame Ragnell types who look, who are very ugly in appearance. We're talking about very, very beautiful women. And there are many stories of warriors who, take the Valkyries to be their wives, but this does not seem to be originally what they were, the way that they were. In fact, there are certain stories from the Eddas that talk about Valkyries who are, who don't want anything to do with men. Okay, they're not interested. They're not there for love. Okay. So the idea of the warrior, or whoever it is, the person who has to prove their worth in some way, taking the female, first of all, there's almost a chivalric attitude to that. The idea of a man proving their worth to this feminine figure who has who is special, who has this kind of power. But we also have this. To me, there's also this idea of taking this kind of raw power that is connected to both love and war. I don't think there necessarily has to be a distinction there, and transforming it into something that is, that can work in conjunction with the man, in the way that Jung talks about the anima as being something. There's always almost an initial struggle with the anima, to find out, to keep from being overpowered by the anima, but trying to come into a correct kind of relationship to the anima. To a certain degree, we saw this in the story of Odysseus and Circe, or Circe. She turns his men into pigs, and he has a special plant that that wards off her spells. So instead of, she basically ends up, they make a deal. She does turn all his men back into men, from being pigs, and then she agrees to help him, but then of course she seduces him. She draws him into bed and has sex with him. Okay, so she's somebody who's a powerful witch with very terrifying powers, but at the same time, there is this seduction aspect, and the idea that the power, this very witchy kind of power, as it were, could be actually used to aid and to help men, like that this is actually would be suggested as the proper role of the anima, or the way that the men have to approach the anima, as kind of an internal figure that they're needing to come into relationship with and into union with, not into contest with. But because we see these ancient figures, I feel like the Valkyries eventually become this kind of type that is kind of the warrior / lover type that we see, like, for example, in a goddess like Ishtar, who is both a goddess of love and a goddess of war. Although she has a much more what's the word I'm looking for? She has a more tumultuous relationship, I think is the word I'm looking for, with Gilgamesh. So this is not... so when we talk about the Valkyries, we're talking originally about women who were these kinds of battlefield demons, as it were. That were very similar to certain aspects of the Morrigan in coming to the battlefield and picking away at the remains of the slain. And then they eventually become these figures who are choosing warriors for this great afterlife, and who are serving these warriors, and who may actually even end up being the wives of these warriors. Now, if we think about war as an act of sovereignty, okay, to get married is to give up one's sovereignty to some degree. If you are a single woman, one of the things that you may cherish is your own sovereignty, your ability to make your own decisions or to control your own destiny. When you marry somebody, even in the most equal of marriages, there's always has to be, you are giving up some consideration of yourself for the other person. And you may be, if you choose to start a family, then you are also, guiding your powers, as it were, into the raising of a child, perhaps, and that kind of protective role that may end up, that is less about you using, maybe getting out into the world and doing certain things. It would be more about that energy that one has, that life energy one has, gets directed towards procreation or towards creating another human being. And in fact, certainly in our more modern culture, the assumption is that that procreation, this is part of the problem, that the old biology is destiny problem. The idea that you have a womb, so that's what your purpose is. That's what you're supposed to use it for. But figures like these are not mother figures. We might think back to goddesses like Artemis or Athena, for instance, in the Greek pantheon, who are, they are virgins. They, and in the most literal sense, not in the ancient sense of unmarried woman, because in that respect, before Aphrodite was married to Hephaestus, she was also considered a virgin. It's more about, and as we can see, Artemis and Athena both have these, they're both fierce hunters or fighters. Athena is a great strategist in war. She's actually more powerful in some cases than the war god Ares, and it's, or Ares or Ares. And it's, but she's a very complex figure. So she's not about love and marriage and all of these things. But yet she is still that feminine embodiment, that embodiment of the feminine in the warrior. And when that embodiment is ignored, it's usually to the great detriment of the warrior. The story of Ajax the Greater, who refuses Athena's help during the Trojan War battle, ends up confusing his mind. He's decided he's put off by the fact that, Odysseus has won certain armor in the funeral games for Achilles. And so he gets very, put out, and he's, plots to kind of kill all of the Achaean generals in their sleep. But then he ends up instead, Athena messes with his head and he ends up killing a bunch of animals instead, which, that's not great either, but, And then she shows Odysseus what he's doing, and she sort of delights in the fact that he's completely out of his mind in this way. And people say, well, gee, that doesn't seem like Athena. She seems like she has to do with fairness and justice. And it's like, yeah, but he refused her on the battlefield, so she basically, this was the consequence of that. And he ends up dying in disgrace and falling on his sword, right? So it's really, it's this idea of rejection of the feminine. Similarly, in the Morrigan stories of Cuchulainn. Cuchulainn frequently makes the mistake when Morrigan comes and says, she wants to offer herself to him, because in offering herself to him, she's granting him victory, because she also is a chooser as to who is going to be victorious in battle. And when he refuses her, then she's out to finish him off, and eventually she does. So, so this is almost this idea of this feminine figure connected to war. Although in this case, a lot of the stories of them, the men are seeking to engage with them and have to prove their worthiness to engage with the Valkyries. Although there are cases where they can, they can trick them again by stealing their clothes, which in this case would have to do with their identity, identity and their role as a Valkyrie. Okay, they, you take that, if that's taken away by deception, then they, they kind of fall into this pattern of having to be the woman who is subject to the man, or subject to the normal rules of marriage and family and so forth, until they're able to reclaim that sovereignty, which the clothing that they wear is emblematic of, in this sense. And so this idea of taming by domestication, which we see in wild animals, the fact that we have dog and cat companions and that they, don't rip our faces off. Well, I guess some of them still do, right? But these are animals that are domesticated, and they walk beside humans. They help humans. They're friends to humans, as opposed to being enemies. But the idea of that domestication does raise a couple of different questions, because on the one hand, you might say, okay, well, this is about these forces kind of working in harmony with each other. However, when the female force has to sort of surrender herself to the male force in this kind of subordinate role, one has to ask the question as to whether or not this is just another patriarchal script about dealing with the strong feminine, or whether or not this is actually, a balancing act of sorts. It's an interesting question. I don't want to really pass a judgment on that, because I think I could probably argue about it more than one way. It's just interesting to see that they kind of end up serving this anima type function as this very powerful female figure that has a certain amount of power over their fate, at least with respect to war, at least with respect to warriors. And and this gives them sort of a role in sovereignty, or granting sovereignty, or at least in dealing with victory. And their connection to the dead, and of course the fact that they wear something like, swan feathers, that's a definite connection to the underworld, because swans are, they have an interesting mythology all of their own. We see swans as having to do with, there are tales throughout Northern Europe of people who are transformed into swans, or who are really swans and take on human form and that sort of thing. But the swan image is, swans tend to be associated very heavily with death or with the otherworld. We talk about the idea of someone's swan song, for example, which is usually their farewell. It could be somebody ending their career, or it could be somebody whose life ends. Although this comes from the idea that the word swan actually comes from a word meaning to sing, and so it's the idea that swans sing at their moment of death, which even back to Pliny the Elder, he's like, yeah, they don't do that. But nonetheless, there's this perception of swans as singing at death. And, but swans also, if you think about their nature, they're very beautiful birds. And we think of the swan as being a full-fledged embodiment of beauty. The old ugly duckling changed into a swan, right? This idea of moving from something more awkward to something that's considered to be more beautiful. But if you also have ever been around a swan, you also know that can be very, very nasty as well. So, they're graceful, beautiful birds that also have a very, very aggressive side. So interesting that they are sort of the the totem bird, or the form taken by the Valkyrie, who has very similar characteristics. But this, and there's definitely this connection to the other world, or to what you might think of in other cultures as being connected to fairy, or the realm of fairy, or at least some version of the other world, because they definitely have this psychopomp role and quality, and they are, but they become, their story changes into something where they're in the service of Odin, and they, and then they become women who are servants rather than necessarily always acting as warriors in their own right. Or perhaps they're doing both, because there may not be a separation of role. I think you start to see more of this separation of role probably as time goes on, because as I had been saying earlier, when you're talking about the Christianization of these older religions, you are talking about the way in which something that had a complexity, that's both, not either or, and then it becomes either or. You can have a female who can be, a warrior and can have all these characteristics, and might also be a wife and mother at the same time, or might have characteristics that are very beneficent and helpful, but also, might be associated with really horrible things too. Like, for example, I think of Artemis and Apollo. I'm sorry to keep going back to the Greek here, but like Apollo is considered to be a god of civilization and like a sun god, and represent, prophecy and all these very high culture kinds of things, but he's also a god of violent death. Similarly, Artemis, who's associated with the hunt and with chastity and with, things like that, is also associated with violent death. They're the twins that are associated with this idea. So there's always, there's always the idea. The feminine often has these very, very complex roles. It's not unilaterally, oh, they're a goddess associated with this thing, like, with traditional marriage, or with war, or with love, and that they're just that one thing, and assume what we think of as all the aspects, all the, the positive, or maybe even the purified aspects of those things. They generally have very complex personalities that are not all about what our ideal might be of that personality. And I think the Valkyries are no exception here. They are, they are clearly warrior women who serve a specific role on the battlefield, and who wield a certain amount of power and a certain amount of, over the warriors. But you see this kind of shift in dynamic where they become more domesticated and become more of the spouses of the warriors. It also makes me think of in Hindu myth, where you have the Shaktis. It should be, you have these Shaktis of the deities. So, so you will have these gods who will have these female counterparts, these Shaktis, which later on become described as their wives. But they're not necessarily their wives. They're the Shaktis. They're the female power that's present within them. And you wonder to some degree whether or not, whether this is present in this this is being implied in Northern European mythology. Not the concept of Shakti, straight, directly like the same as what we see in India, but this idea of this powerful feminine that, the whole, behind every great man is a woman who drives things. I mean, it's that kind of a thing. This idea of this feminine aspect of the warrior that is, that gives the warrior their power to some degree, or is what allows them to reach their potential. Okay, which also, again, psychologically speaking, is the function of the soul. That one's connection with the soul is what allows them to reach their greatest potential. So I feel like there's an aspect of this in the Valkyries, and it's interesting, but it's interesting to note the dynamic between the Valkyrie and the male warriors whom they are either bringing to Valhalla, or the ones who they encounter in various other stories and circumstances. And, and the fact that they originally had this role that was extremely terrifying and perhaps considered even demonic. And I can't help, I mean, even though there's probably a certain amount of, channeling or working with that that feminine force that allows you to, that is connected with these terrifying things like, death and fighting and bloodshed and things like that, which I've always said are very distinctly feminine things. We always think of those things as being masculine, but I'm like, no, warfare definitely, I mean, there's probably an aspect in both, to be fair, but there's definitely a very strong feminine aspect to warfare, and it seems to be also very much connected with love, and not just in the most literal social senses. In the way somebody might, fight for love, for example. It's not necessarily about that, because the same instinct that makes us get attracted to somebody, that drives us towards somebody, is the similar kind of, the way in which you might overcome in a way that you might want to possess somebody, may also get wrapped up in ideas of sovereignty that we have with war, where people want to possess something that somebody else has, whether it be their land or their, their wealth or whatever it is. There's this idea of that acquiring aspect of it. And then the idea of having that sovereignty, or, how that sovereignty might be yielded. Or how you get, these warlike female figures to hand over their sovereignty in some fashion, or to, or to compromise it in some way. So, it's an interesting thing to think about, the whole idea of these terrifying female figures that become transformed into these beautiful women who act as these kinds of psychopomps for the great warriors who are chosen, and and the way in which they interact. Either you, like I said, from one extreme where you have the Valkyries will have nothing to do with men, to those who are who offer themselves up as their wives, and again, when you're talking about the Eddas, you're talking about the serving the men in the hall. So there's this interesting transformation from whatever the kind of raw power that they had to something that's a bit more domesticated. And I don't know. I suppose it's up for debate as to whether that's what message we should take away from that. But again, if we're talking about sovereignty, I suppose it comes down to a matter of choice, because in order to sometimes yielding, being passive, or surrendering one's power in some way is a way to actually gain power. So there's more that you can do together than working in opposition to each other. But it's clear that there's this separation now. Like the Valkyrie becomes maybe less of a warrior figure herself, and may move more into the space where she's maybe more of a domestic figure in certain cases. I don't know. You can tell me what you think about that. There's some people who are, very, very much into this particular mythology, and, can look at all the aspects there. But to me, I see a variation in the stories that I have actually read. And, they are, I don't know, they're definitely magical women. And, I'm just looking at this discussion of the origins of the Valkyries. There is a Hilda Davidson. She places emphasis on the fact that Valkyrie literally means chooser of the slain, and she's talking about a work, an Anglo-Saxon work by Wulfstan, mentioning of the chooser of the slain in the Sermo Lupi ad Anglos sermon, in which appears among a blacklist of sinners, witches, and evildoers, to all the other classes whom he mentions, and concludes that those are human ones. It seems unlikely that he has introduced mythological figures as well. So then there's this additional little piece here about the idea that the human Valkyries, like the ones who are human women who gain some kind of a power, now they're associated with the witchcraft, like they're doing the devil's work, because these are women who are now going beyond the power that they are supposed to have. So again, so we see these tensions between women's power and how that power is used and how that power dynamic comes in contact with other powerful men. Okay, so lots to think about there. I think that's where I'm going to end because, again, this is something I could probably go off in a lot of different directions, but I think that sufficiently makes the points that I wanted to make. Thank you so much again for listening. Please, you can check out all my work at Chthonia.net. If you would like to support my work, please visit patreon.com/Chthonia. Viewers now, I've gotten into the groove now of having an extra podcast or extra discussion about the things I'm working on, or just other topics that come up, on Patreon for those at the $5 level and above. And there's some additional perks for people who, the $10 or $20 level and above. There's, I can provide more copies of works that I've written and so forth for those who are interested, and more services if they're desired. And eventually, what I would like to do is just have maybe special classes or other things for those who are interested at that level as well. Right now, there's a lot there that's still in formulation, but there's definitely, if you want extra material, not only discussions of other things that I've done or more about the topics I talk about here, but also other topics that I have worked on that are related to the dark feminine. So patreon.com/Chthonia. I'm on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word on Instagram and Twitter, 2 words on Facebook, and I'm just Chthonia on YouTube. Thanks so much for listening. Until the next time.